I was taught in school that the mandate of the Federal Reserve was to stabilize the economy, stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar, you know, and to make America a better place, you know. That's the mandate that we were told. Well, if you give the Federal Reserve a report card on how well it did in meeting this mandate, they get failing marks all the way up and down the line. They haven't done any of those things. We've had the period of greatest inflation, economic booms and busts, and we've had chaos in the market, so it fails. But if you recognize its true mandate, its true purpose is to benefit the banks, and if necessary, plunder the American people to bail out the banks and make sure that they have made plenty of profits. Now, if that's what you recognize is its goal, now it gets A's on its report card all the way up and down the line.
Some people say, oh, the Fed is a public institution because it's formed by the government. Some people say this is a private institution because look at how it's structured. It's a corporate structure. You say it's a private cartel, but I think you've also said that it's a public-private partnership. So can you kind of break down how you come to this conclusion?
Well, yes, it is really it's a hybrid, isn't it? It has some of the characteristics of a government agency because it has the police power behind it. What they basically did when they created the Fed back in 1913, they actually drafted a cartel agreement between the big banks, and then they took this cartel agreement to Washington, got a big eraser, and took the words off the top of the paper that says cartel agreement, and they wrote in the words Federal Reserve Act. And so it was passed into law, and now it has the force of the police in enforcing every provision of the cartel agreement. So we think it's a government agency because if you violate the rules of the banks, you go to prison. So it seems like it's a government agency, but it's really not. It's a private institution like any cartel. It's made up of the largest banks in America. And but it's not really a purely private institution either, because if it were, and it does issue stock, of course, the banks all hold some stock in it, but if that was real, genuine stock like in any other corporation, they'd be able to sell it, wouldn't they? If you own something, you can sell it. But the member banks are not allowed to sell their stock. They don't have voting rights. They can't select who's their chairman. They can't put people on the board of directors. So it's the appearance of being a private corporation. And so in essence, we're dealing with a hybrid. It's nothing more but a legal framework that makes the operation of a banking cartel so powerful because it's backed by the force of the government.
And I want to get into another thing you said, which is that the Federal Reserve is there to support the banks, that the Federal Reserve is doing the bidding of the banks and supporting the banking sector. Oh, did I get you wrong? Go ahead and clarify.
No, they are the banks. The Federal Reserve are the banks.
Okay.
That's what they are. It's a cartel, you see.
Okay.
It's like OPEC. It's like OPEC. What is OPEC? Well, it's the oil-producing countries.
But the Fed then has the ability to issue money and to affect interest rates, set the interest rates, all of these things. And yet when I've suggested, or when people have suggested that it is acting to support the banks, I've argued with people about that. Some people would be called, you know, conspiratorial for suggesting that. It's not obviously the Fed's official mandate. So how do we know that? And how does it work exactly? Does, you know, Lloyd Blankfein pick up the phone and tell Bernanke to jump and he says, how high?
Well, Bernanke doesn't really set the policies. Remember, he's working for the banks, isn't he? He's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is a cartel. Back over to that track again. And so Bernanke doesn't really determine these policies. Before he announces something, he's on the phone talking to his employers, the banks, you see. And how do you know that it's for the banks, of the banks, and so forth? Just follow the money. That's the old adage, isn't it? If you want to know what's going on, follow the money. So you take all of these so-called bailouts that have been going on starting in big time since 2008, billions and billions, and now we find out trillions of dollars being created out of nothing by the Federal Reserve and pumped into the economy. Where does it go? It goes to the banks, doesn't it? And some of it, of course, goes to the big corporations like General Motors and that sort of, or to countries, Mexico and so forth. But what is unique about those corporations in those countries? And it's always the same thing. They owe money to the banks, and they can't pay. And that's why we send money to those corporations and to the countries so they can continue those interest payments to the bank. All of this money, if you follow it, comes back to the banks. And if you can't figure that out, you know, that's pretty simple.